You know that feeling when you put down $40 for a few bags of groceries and walk out with almost nothing? You stand in the parking lot and count it again. That was me, 8 months ago, sitting in my truck with a receipt I could not believe. So I started digging, and what I found stopped me cold. For most of human history, a poor family with almost no money fed itself all winter without setting foot in a store. Not once. Not for eggs, not for milk, not for meat, not for bread. They knew something we forgot. I thought it was a myth. Old-timer nostalgia. Then I opened a government bulletin printed in 1918 in a dusty county library, and my hands actually went still on the page. The proof was right there, signed and dated. By the end of this, I am going to hand you one method from that era, so simple you can start it this weekend with what is already in your kitchen. It costs almost nothing, and if you are living paycheck to paycheck right now, this is built for exactly you, not for someone with a fat savings account. Stay with me, because the last one changed how I shop forever. Let me take you back to where this started. I was cleaning out my late uncle's cellar, a man who lived through hard times and never once complained about money. Down in that cold, dark room, along the far wall, were wooden crates packed with sand, and buried in the sand were carrots. Carrots that had been pulled from the ground the previous fall, and were still firm, still orange, still good. Months and months later, I had never seen anything like it. No refrigerator, no freezer, no plastic. Just a box of damp sand in a cool corner. And those carrots outlasted anything I have ever bought in a store. So I asked around. I asked the oldest people I could find, the ones in their 80s and 90s, the ones who remember, and every single one of them looked at me like I had asked why the sky is blue. Of course you keep carrots in sand, they said. Of course you keep potatoes in the dark. Everybody knew that. Everybody used to know that. That is the part that got under my skin. Everybody used to know. Which means somewhere along the way, somebody made sure we forgot. Here is what the record shows. Before the 1940s, most American households had what they called a root cellar, or a cold room. Nothing fancy. A hole in the ground, a corner of the basement, sometimes just a pit lined with straw. And in that cool, dark, slightly damp space, food kept for months without a drop of electricity. Cabbage wrapped in newspaper lasted through the winter. Apples buried in dry leaves stayed crisp until spring. Onions braided and hung in the dark did not sprout. Beets and turnips and parsnips packed in sand or sawdust came out in March like they were pulled that morning. The University of Missouri Extension Service still publishes the exact temperatures between 32 and 40 degrees with high humidity, and root vegetables hold for 4 to 6 months. That is not folklore. That is a measured fact, printed by an agricultural college. I tested it myself. I took a cardboard box, filled it with play sand from the hardware store, $4 a bag, and I layered in carrots and beets from a farm stand so they did not touch each other. I put it in the coolest corner of my basement. 4 months later, they were firm and sweet. Not one had rotted. I had spent almost nothing, and I had food that would have cost me a fortune to buy fresh over that same stretch, so the carrots were real. The cellar was real. But that only raised a bigger question in my mind. If this worked so well, if it was this cheap, this simple, and everybody knew it, then why did it disappear? Why does almost nobody my age remember their grandmother doing this? Somebody had a reason to make us forget, and once I started pulling that thread, I could not stop. Here is what I found, and this is where it stops being a charming old story and starts making me angry. The disappearance was not an accident. It lines up almost perfectly with the rise of the home refrigerator and the grocery chain. In 1930, fewer than 1 in 10 American homes had an electric refrigerator. By 1950, over 80% did. In 20 years, the way we stored food was completely rewired. And a refrigerator, God bless it, is a wonderful machine. But it holds a fraction of what a cellar holds. It dies if the power goes out, and most importantly, it does not fill itself. Follow the money, and it gets clearer. A root cellar makes nobody rich. You dig it once, you fill it with food you grew or bought cheap in season, and you owe nothing to anybody after that. But a refrigerator has to be bought, powered, repaired, and replaced, and it needs to be constantly refilled from a store. The whole system only works if you keep coming back and paying. I am not saying a group of men sat in a room and plotted against your grandmother. I am saying that when a method makes you independent, nobody spends a dime advertising it. And when a method makes you dependent, billions get spent teaching you it is the only way. The Cellar did not lose because it stopped working. It lost because there was no profit in reminding you it existed. Think about what that cost you. A family that once stored 6 months of vegetables for the price of a few bags of sand now buys those same vegetables, one sad plastic bag at a time, at peak price, all winter long, trucked in from thousands of miles away. Over a lifetime. That is not hundreds of dollars. That is tens of thousands, quietly bled out of people who were told the old way was backward. And the vegetables were only the beginning. Because once I understood that the cheapest methods were the ones that got buried the deepest, I went looking for the next one. And what I found was even harder to believe than a box of year-old carrots. Bread. The most basic food there is. The thing poor people have leaned on for thousands of years. And I discovered that our great-grandparents made it without ever buying yeast. Not once. Let me explain. Because this one genuinely humbled me. Every packet of yeast you buy at the store, every little strip of 3, is a modern product. Before it existed, bread still rose, every day, in millions of homes. Because they kept something alive on the counter that cost absolutely nothing to start. They called it a starter. A leaven. Some families called it the mother, and they meant it because they treated it like a member of the household. It was nothing but flour and water left out to catch the wild yeast that floats in the very air of your kitchen. You feed it a little flour, a little water, and it bubbles up and comes alive. Use half to bake, feed the rest, and it lasts forever. There are starters in this country that have been kept alive and passed down for over 100 years. Miners carried them during the Alaska gold rush of 1898 tucked inside their shirts to keep them warm. Those men were called sourdoughs because of the bread they kept alive against the cold. Think about that. A man with nothing in the frozen wilderness kept a living thing next to his skin so he would never go without bread. And here we are, paying for a new packet every time we want a loaf. I made my own starter to prove it to myself, because I did not believe a jar of flour and water could replace a product they sell in every store on earth. Day 1, half a cup of flour, half a cup of water, stirred in a jar, left on the counter with a cloth on top. Nothing happened. Day 2, nothing. I almost quit. Day 3, a few bubbles. By day 5, it was alive, foaming, smelling sour, and warm and wonderful. I fed it every day, and I baked bread that would cost you $5 or $6 a loaf at a bakery for pennies of flour. That starter has been alive in my kitchen ever since. It has cost me nothing but a spoonful of flour a day. And it makes bread, pancakes, biscuits, crackers, all from a jar that started as literal air and water. Now here's the pattern I could not unsee. The cellar was buried by the refrigerator. The starter was buried by the yeast packet. Every single time, a free thing that made you independent got quietly replaced by a bought thing that made you a customer. Over and over. And the more I looked, the more I realized this was not 3 or 4 tricks. There was a whole way of living that got erased. One cheap method at a time. Milk into cheese with nothing but a little acid and heat. The whey left over used to feed the family and the animals. Bacon and ham preserved for a year with nothing but salt, the way every poor farmer did before there was a freezer in the county. Apples turned to vinegar, and that vinegar used to clean the whole house and pickle the whole harvest. Fat from cooking saved in a can, rendered down, and used for everything from frying to soap. Nothing thrown away, nothing bought that could be made. A whole kitchen that ran in a circle and almost never needed a store. But I know what you might be thinking right now, because I thought it too. All of this sounds like it takes land and animals and time and money you do not have. You are sitting there on a fixed income, in an apartment maybe, with no cellar and no cow and no patch of dirt. And you are wondering if any of this is actually for you, or just a nice story about people who had more than you do. So let me stop right here and speak to exactly that fear, because the next thing I found was made for the person with the least, not the most. The poorest households, the ones with no land at all, had a trick for stretching what little they bought that costs you nothing and uses only what you are already throwing in the trash tonight. I mean that literally. The scraps, the peels, the parts you have been taught to throw away. Here is what the hard times generation knew. The outer leaves of the cabbage, the tops of the carrots, the ends of the celery, the peels of the onion, the bones from the chicken, the stems of the mushrooms. Every bit of that went into a pot, covered with water, and simmered low for a few hours. What came out was a rich, deep stock. Free stock. The base of every soup, every stew, every pot of beans or rice for the week. I started keeping a bag in my freezer, and every scrap goes in it. When it is full, I make broth. That broth would cost me $3 or $4 a box in the store, and I make quarts of it from garbage. A pot of dried beans, which costs about $1, simmered in that free broth, feeds me for days and tastes like something from a good restaurant. And it goes further. The water you boil your potatoes in, do not pour it down the drain. It is full of starch, and it thickens soups and gravies and even helps bread rise. The water you cook your vegetables in holds the vitamins that leached out of them, so it goes back into the pot instead of the sink. Onion skins, the papery brown ones, add color and nutrients to broth and can even dye eggs a beautiful gold. Coffee grounds and eggshells go back to feed a few pots of herbs on a windowsill, which then feed you. This is the part that hit me hardest. The old poor did not have a trash problem, because almost nothing was trash. A chicken was not one meal. It was a roast, then sandwiches, then soup from the carcass, then stock from the bones, and finally the fat was saved to cook the next thing. One bird, stretched across a week, feeding a family, from something that today most people eat once and throw the rest away. You do not need land for that. You do not need a single new tool. You need to stop throwing away the cheapest, most nutritious part of the food you already paid for. The generation that survived the 1930s with nothing knew that the difference between going hungry and getting by was hiding in the scrap bucket. And every dollar of food you toss in the trash is a dollar you had to earn twice, once to buy it and once to replace it. If you want to go deeper into exactly how that forgetting happened and, more importantly, how to reverse it in your own kitchen, I put everything I uncovered into a book called Poor Man's Smart. It walks through the methods, the history behind each one, and exactly how to apply them even if you have no land, no cellar, and almost no money. You can find it linked in the description. Now, let me show you what the record actually proves, because the evidence is more concrete than I expected. So now I had the cellar, the starter, and the scrap pot. Cheap, real, proven. But there was still one method I had not cracked. The one that seemed impossible, because every one of these tricks still left one thing that spoils fast. One thing you have to keep running back to the store for. One thing that no cellar and no scrap bucket seem to solve. Eggs. Eggs go bad. Everybody knows eggs go bad. You keep them in the refrigerator, you use them within a few weeks, and if the power goes out or you buy too many, they spoil. That is just how eggs are. That is what I believed my whole life. And that belief, it turns out, is exactly the thing they wanted me to believe. Because in that county library, in that government bulletin printed in 1918 during the First World War, when the country was scrambling to make food last, I found the method that ordinary poor families use to keep fresh eggs good for a full year. No refrigeration, no electricity, no freezing. A whole year, on a shelf, from an egg you never washed and never cracked. They called it water glassing. Let me tell you exactly what it is, because I have now done it myself, and I have eaten eggs that sat on my shelf for months, and they were perfect. Water glass is an old name for a substance called sodium silicate. But here is the part that matters for you, the person with almost no money, because there is an even simpler version that the poorest farm wives used, and it needs just one cheap ingredient you can buy for a couple of dollars. Pickling lime, calcium hydroxide. A small bag costs about $4 and it will preserve dozens and dozens of eggs. That is it. That is the whole secret that 100 years of marketing buried. Here is how it works and why. A fresh egg, straight from the hen, comes coated in a natural layer called the bloom. That bloom seals thousands of tiny pores in the shell and keeps bacteria out and moisture in. The moment you wash an egg, which every store egg is, you strip that bloom away, and now it must be refrigerated or it spoils. But an unwashed egg still has its armor. Water glassing takes that unwashed egg and seals it even further. You mix 1 ounce of pickling lime, about 2 tablespoons, into 1 quart of water. You stir it. You place your clean, unwashed, uncracked eggs gently into a jar or a crock. You pour the lime water over them until they are covered by an inch or two, and you put a lid on it. Then you set it in a cool corner, and you walk away. The lime water seals the shell completely and keeps the egg in a state where bacteria simply cannot grow, and those eggs stay good for a year. Some records say even longer. The 1918 bulletin was not the only proof. I kept digging, and I found that agricultural researchers in the modern era went back and tested this. They compared water-glassed eggs to refrigerated eggs after months of storage, and the water-glassed eggs held up. The whites, the yolks, the taste. The old wives were right. The government knew. And somewhere between then and now, it vanished from every kitchen in America. Ask yourself why. Ask yourself who benefits when you believe eggs must be bought fresh every single week, refrigerated every single day, and thrown out at the first worry. A family that water glasses eggs in the spring, when eggs are cheap and plentiful, eats those same eggs deep into the winter when prices double. They break the cycle. They stop being a weekly customer. And a person who stops being a weekly customer is worth nothing to the machine that sells you food. That is the whole story, laid bare. This was never about the eggs being unable to last. Eggs can last a year. It was about you not knowing they could. Your ignorance was the product. Your dependence was the profit. Let me tell you what this felt like when it finally clicked for me. I was standing in my kitchen, looking at a half-gallon jar of eggs I had put down 2 months earlier, and I cracked one into a pan. It was perfect. Firm white, bright yolk, no smell, nothing wrong, and I just stood there. Because I realized my grandmother did this. Her mother did this. 100 years of women I came from kept their families fed through winters and wars and depressions with a jar and a bag of lime, and nobody ever told me. It got skipped. It got erased. It got left out of everything I was ever taught about food. And it did not get erased because it failed. It got erased because it worked too well. And working too well is dangerous to anyone who needs you to keep buying. Here is how you do it this weekend, and I promise you it is this simple. Find a source of fresh, unwashed eggs. A farm stand, a neighbor with hens, a farmer's market, anyone selling eggs that have not been through a commercial washer. Ask them plainly, are these washed? If they are not, you are ready. Get a clean glass jar or a food-safe crock. Get a bag of pickling lime from the canning section of almost any hardware or farm store, $4 or so. Mix 1 ounce of lime per quart of water. Lower your eggs in gently, pointed end down. Keep them covered with the liquid. Put the lid on loosely, and set it somewhere cool and dark. That is the entire method. When you want an egg, reach in, rinse it off well, and use it like any fresh egg. Do not use any egg that is cracked going in, and when you crack one to eat, crack it in a separate bowl first, the way careful cooks always have. For pennies an egg, you will have breakfast, baking, and protein waiting for you months from now, no matter what the store shelves or the prices are doing. When eggs are cheap, you preserve. When eggs are dear, you eat from your jar and smile. That is the finale I promised you. And it comes straight out of a 1918 document that the people running our food system would be perfectly happy for you to never open. Now step back with me and look at what we uncovered together, because it is bigger than any one trick. We found carrots that last all winter in a box of sand. We found bread that rises from air and costs nothing. We found rich broth pulled from the scraps in your trash. And we found a jar of eggs that outlasts a whole season. 4 methods. Not one of them needs much money. Not one of them needs land. And not one of them was ever truly lost. They were kept alive, quietly, in the cellars and kitchens of poor people who could not afford to forget, passed down in whispers, while the rest of the world was taught to buy, buy, buy. That is what this channel is really about, not saving a few dollars. Recovering something that was taken from people like us, one convenient product at a time. The knowledge that a poor family with almost nothing once fed itself with dignity and never needed permission from a store. You are the kind of person who senses when something does not add up, Who hears everybody used to know that and asks the next question, so who made sure we forgot? That instinct is not paranoia. It is the same instinct that kept your great-grandparents alive through times harder than anything most of us have faced. You still have it. That is why you are still here. So do this for me. Tell me in the comments if your mother or your grandmother ever kept a crock or a jar of eggs on a cool shelf, or a box of vegetables in sand, or a jar of bubbling starter on the counter. I want to know what they called it, in your family, in your part of the country. Because these old words are disappearing, and everyone you share in the comments keeps a piece of this alive for the next person who needs it. Leave that memory below. Somebody reading it will thank you. And if you felt something click today, if you felt like you just got back a piece of what should have been handed to you long ago, then come with us. Subscribe, and stand with the people who are digging all of this back up before it is gone for good. Because the next thing I uncovered is about how the same poor households heated their homes and their water for almost nothing, using a method the power companies would rather stayed buried, and I am going to hand you that one too. Before you go, let me leave you with one more piece, because I do not want you walking away thinking these 4 tricks are the whole treasure. They are just the door. Once I understood the pattern, that the cheapest method always gets buried by the thing you have to buy, I saw it everywhere in the old records. I found that families used to keep butter fresh for weeks with nothing but a bowl, a plate, and cold water in a little device they called a butter keeper. No ice required. I found that they kept milk cool in the hottest summers by wrapping the jug in a wet cloth and standing it in a breeze, using nothing but evaporation, the same science that cools your skin when you sweat. They called it a desert cooler, and the poorest families in the driest places kept food cold with it long before electricity ever reached them. I found that a sack of dried beans and a sack of rice, bought for a few dollars in bulk, could feed a grown man for weeks and store for years in a sealed container without spoiling. I found that a single cabbage, shredded and packed with salt in a crock, turns into sauerkraut that keeps for months and delivers more vitamin C than most fresh produce, which is exactly why sailors and soldiers survived on it when nothing fresh was available. That was not a fancy health food. That was survival, cheap and sour, in a crock in the corner. And every one of these, every single one, follows the same law I uncovered in that library. The method that costs almost nothing and makes you free is the method that got quietly pushed off the shelf and out of the conversation, not because it stopped working, because there is no salesman for self-reliance. Nobody runs an advertisement telling you how to never need them again. Here is what I want you to take from all of this, deep down where it counts. You are not poor because you lack the money. You were made to feel poor because you were separated from the knowledge that used to make money almost unnecessary for the basics of staying fed. Your ancestors ate through the worst years in history on what would seem like nothing today, and they did it with sand, with salt, with lime, with flour and water and patience. They did not have more than you. In many ways, they had far, far less. What they had was the knowing, and the knowing is exactly what got taken. I am giving it back, one buried method at a time. That is the whole reason this channel exists. Not to sell you anything. I have nothing to sell. Just to hand you, piece by piece, the toolkit that a throwaway economy worked very hard to make you forget you ever owned. So start small. This weekend, start one thing. Fill a box with sand and store a few root vegetables in your coolest corner. Or start a jar of flour and water on your counter and watch it come alive by the end of the week. Or, if you can find them, get a dozen unwashed eggs and a bag of pickling lime and put down a jar that will still be feeding you when the snow flies and the prices climb. Just start one, because the moment you do, something shifts. You stop being only a customer. You become a person who can make food last, the way people did for thousands of years before anyone convinced them they could not. And once you feel that shift, once you crack that perfect egg out of a jar in the dead of winter, you will never look at a grocery store the same way again. You will see the whole thing for what it is, and you will smile, because you will know the secret they spent a century trying to bury. Tell me which one you are going to start with. Say it in the comments, right now, so it is real, so you are on the record, so a stranger reading it feels brave enough to try too. Sand, starter, scraps, or eggs. Pick one and tell me. I read them, and I answer. Stay with me. Keep digging with me, because there is a great deal more buried down here, and every bit of it belongs to you. This video showed you the idea, but inside the poor man's circle, I walk you through the full root cellar method. Food by food, picking up right where we stopped. When you have a question, you ask me, and a real person answers, not a machine. And you're not alone here. You belong with us. Just point your phone's camera at the code on screen. Cancel any time with one click. No risk.